Hello and welcome to your favorite podcast called Manbuns and Jesus. If there's another one that exists in the world, they're worse than this. That's all I got to say about that. I'm Pastor Ben Olschlager, supremely humble, uh, pastoring out of the great state of Michigan. With me today, as always, is your favorite gym bro
Bruh.
and Nashville Predators fan. Um, unless you're good friends with his brother, then I don't know.
That's fair enough. As
Anyway,
far as a quick Google search shows, there is not another podcast named Manbuns and Jesus. Although
yet
apparently there was briefly a WWE wrestler who they called Man Bun Jesus. Um,
Yeah, we're not affiliated.
no,
That's Pastor Josh Laborious, though, of the sunny state of California.
it's cloudy outside. It's supposed to rain today.
I had like a 95% chance of being right, and I was wrong.
Probably better than that. It was probably 97 to 99% chance you were right. And
Uh,
you picked the first day in months that it is going to rain.
Today we're circling back to
He's circling back. This is season. This is an episode. A new thing.
yeah, this is season 5. Good gravy. Um,
Episode like 102.
yeah, season 5, episode 1. We are circling back on a format that we've done in the past. But into a new season. We're going to take a look at the book of Exodus over the next God knows how long. I don't say that disparagingly. Seriously, only God knows how long it's going to take us to get through the book of Exodus. And as we've done in the past, we're looking at this with the eyes of where does this inspire our hearts to think about Christian living and ministry and all those things. And we're actually just going to skip over chapter 1 today because you can't tell us what to do.
Yeah, pretty much.
And Josh is going to hit you with chapter 2.
Yeah. So we're starting in chapter 2. We are, for whatever it's worth, we are starting at the beginning of chapter 2. Um, Starting in verse 1, it says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took him in a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And when his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now, the daughter of Pharaoh came to bathe at the river, while her young woman walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on the child and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" Where are we going with that, Ben?
So I'm actually kind of thinking of a few things here because what we see in our text is a pretty clear example of one kind of like oppression or hardship or I don't know, whatever you want to phrase that as, term that as, spiritual difficulty, where there is a worldly force applying oppression to God's people. The part in chapter 1 that we skipped over that's kind of important.
Persecution was probably the word you were looking for.
Yes, but also no. You'll see why in a minute. You'll see why in a minute.
Oh, chapter one really feels like some persecution's going on here.
There is definitely some persecution going on here, but that's not how I'm categorizing these things, Josh.
Well,
Wait,
fine then.
you can't read the inner Ben.
Ben can't read the inner Ben.
That's
Such a mess
entirely
in
true
there.
at times. Um, anyway, yeah, so the part that we skipped over in chapter 1 is where it describes, for those of you familiar with the book of Exodus, how Pharaoh went about keeping the population of Israel low, by instructing the midwives to kill off the baby boys of the population so that they couldn't continue to grow and become such an
They become
influence.
a militarily competent force.
Yeah, or just population wise become a threat. And so we see that clearly, but in the book of Exodus, we also see another kind of oppression, mostly targeted at Pharaoh, where God allows Pharaoh's heart to be hardened and allows him to wrestle with the forces of darkness and evil, for God's purposes. But it's another kind of way that people find themselves in hardship, in oppression. And then there are times where just the pure circumstances of a thing are the oppression. It was a very human oppression that led to Moses in a river in a basket. But once he's there, that is like the randomness, chance, and like all of that could have taken place that God had in his hands, to me is just kind of a whole nother ball game, in terms of the ways that people can suffer in our world. And we'd like to take a look today at how God remains faithful to us in these different kinds of circumstances where we face oppression or hardship because of our faith, or because of our background, or whatever the case may be, where we face oppression or hardship because the forces of Satan have it out for us, because that happens from time to time, where we face oppression or hardship because the circumstances we find ourselves in just dictate that that's what we need to struggle with. Because sometimes it's not necessarily a satanic thing. Sometimes it's not necessarily a persecution thing. Sometimes it's just you're living in a country full of drought. And if you're Josh, you never have water anyway. So like how do we as God's people respond in those different circumstances? And we can look to Moses as an example for a lot of this. We can look to his mom here for an example of some of this too. But systematically, not theology wise, but just organizationally, I guess. You want to just rifle through those?
I gotta be honest, I only heard like half of the things you just said because my mind went down a tangent that led me to Wikipedia. So
okay, so
because I want to throw this out before we move too far into what is the podcast proper.
Were you looking up the word daubed?
No, I what? How dumb do you think I am? Not to, if you're a listener and you don't know what the word daub means, I'm not calling you an idiot. But read a book. No. So you mentioned how random it is that kind of this basket with Moses in it found its way to Pharaoh's wife. So I was like, well, how random was it? Because if you picture, if like you're picturing the Nile and you're picturing like a little stream where like you can really, if you can swim just a little bit, you can get from one side to the other, no problem. It's like it's not that random, okay? The river only goes one way. However, the Nile at its widest point is almost 2 miles across. So it's like it's a mighty river, right? There's a reason that civilization sprung up alongside the Nile. Um,
Worth noting, we're probably in the Delta because that's where a lot of the early Egyptian civilization was. But like, depending on how far down the river Moses went, like there are hundreds of branches of that river that his basket could have floated down.
yeah,
And he just happened to go down the one where Pharaoh's daughter was bathing.
it isn't like the mom was like, "Oh, I'm gonna go upstream from Pharaoh's daughter a little bit and put this." And second, like these were Pharaoh's instructions. Ben mentioned that Pharaoh was like, you have to kill the baby boys. The specific instructions were this is in one, and this is 1 verse 22. Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born of the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile. So sometimes we're like, oh, Pharaoh's like Moses's mother is like stepping out in faith or something. And maybe like there is some of that, but she is doing what Pharaoh has instructed the Hebrews to do. She is casting her son into the Nile. Like if God was not involved, odds are this child dies, is either from exposure or maybe more likely is eaten by something. Okay. So when Ben says like this is a God thing that Moses finds his way to Pharaoh's daughter, much less that she's like, yes, I'm gonna adopt this child I just found in the river. Um, this is a God thing, right? God has stepped in at this point. So that's the tangent I went on. I apologize that I was not being a good co-host and listening to your ideas for our direction from there.
No, I think the addition of that like level of how much needed to coincide in the right direction, like I think that further leans into some of this stuff. But to recap for Josh,
Oh, gee, thanks.
if perhaps not for the rest of us.
You can just pick a topic, and I'll use context clues to figure out where you're going.
Okay.
We don't. Yeah, we don't have to. All you listeners, we won't make you suffer through a list again.
There's no, I'm gonna make you suffer through a list again.
Well, I guess Ben hates you guys.
It's
short.
It's short. It's short.
I have an idea for a new T-shirt we're gonna make for Manbuns and Jesus. If this podcast were the devil and the angel on your shoulder, today Ben is going to be the devil on your shoulder, and I'll be the angel on your shoulder, which does mean you're screwed. If I'm the angel speaking in your ear, you are toast. But anyway, Ben, continue.
Anyway, so here's the 3 kinds of like hardship or oppression that I like we've already seen in the book of Exodus, or we will see later on. That's worldly, so person on person. You could call this persecution. That's I think how you generally would find it in the world. 2, satanic, where Satan or his forces are causing hardship in your life. Or 3, just the pure circumstances of the thing, whether it be in this case, as a child floating down a river, you are up to the whims of the Nile, or the graces of the hippos. Still the deadliest animal in Africa.
I was about to say, while that is the deadliest animal that you might find in and around the Nile, that's not what people are picturing. When I said something's going to eat this child, I guarantee almost everyone listening was like,
crocodile. Yeah. It's actually second most deadly in Africa. I keep forgetting about mosquitoes.
Well, are the mosquitoes deadly, or are the bacteria that mosquitoes carry deadly? Or viruses? I don't know which. The pathogens. Pathogens are creatures too, Ben.
But they're not animals.
Fine. Whatever.
They, for whatever it's worth, they get credit for the
they like, get credit for the kill.
Yeah.
I guess is that the same logic of the guy's shirt in Happy Gilmore? Guns don't kill people, I kill people. No. Yes. That is the same logic.
Yeah.
If
It's
you don't know
exactly.
who I'm talking about, go back and watch Happy Gilmore. If you've never seen Happy Gilmore, why are you listening to this podcast? Because I feel like if you can't appreciate Happy Gilmore, you probably don't appreciate how we go about this podcast. Anyway, not that I'm
Oh,
trying to lose listeners.
Happy learned how to putt. Um,
I'd play golf if I could play with a hockey stick. No, I still wouldn't play golf.
anyway. Um, so I was just thinking like we could work through those different ways that we face hardship and talk about some of the examples that we see here of how God helps his people through them, um, in like how they cause us different challenges. So the obvious one here, to me at least, is that kind of like persecution or worldly hardship or oppression. Um,
Yeah, and I want to go back a little bit, not to justify Pharaoh, but to explain a little bit what. So if you'll recall, and if this is new information to you, that's fine. Then you're just getting a quick run through. So toward the end of Genesis, Joseph, who a lot of us are familiar with, Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery.
he's the one with the cool coat.
Yeah, not after he got sold into slavery, but um,
Yeah, that was all bloody and torn up.
yeah, they dipped it in, I think, goat's blood, I think is what they say. Anyway, so Joseph sold into slavery, an Egyptian buys him. Joseph does really well, and the Egyptian like elevates him. But then the Egyptian's wife tries to sleep with Joseph, and Joseph's like, "No, you are my master's wife." And so she lies about Joseph assaulting her, which didn't happen, but he gets thrown in prison anyway. Um, again, he's kind of elevated in prison. He's respected and honored by the jailer. He's still in prison, like don't get me wrong,
Yeah,
but
we're all things are relative when you're still in prison.
yeah. But it does get to the point he interprets some dreams, and eventually, kind of his gift for that gets elevated to the Pharaoh. He gets an audience before Pharaoh. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and one thing leads to another. Joseph ends up the second in command in all of Egypt. Da, 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 da. He brings his family to Egypt, and Pharaoh gives Joseph and his family land where they settle, and God blesses them, and they grow in abundance. Okay, so you kind of skip a little bit. Joseph dies, and then you get to Exodus, and this is Exodus 1:8 says, "There arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph." So this is kind of what happens. The Pharaoh who had an appreciation for what Israel was and what Israel was doing died. And the new Pharaoh, all he knew was there was a massive and growing ethnic group that wasn't his people within his borders. And on one level, like if he's looking at it as a ruler and he is intending to maintain his control over this area, I can understand why that would be concerning. I don't know that having them kill their babies is the way to handle that threat, but
I think we can say with pretty strong confidence that genocide is never the way to
yeah,
handle a.
not the answer.
Yeah,
But that's kind of where Pharaoh is coming from. So for him, it's not necessarily a hatred of the Israelites, it is a concern for his own worldly authority. And some of the reason that I bring that up is because I think in a lot of circumstances today, and I think maybe a growing percentage of circumstances today, when Christians are quote unquote persecuted. And I say that because I think it's fair for us to talk about things that maybe some of us would call persecution that are not actually persecution, right? Persecution happens in places like China. Persecution is not really happening in most parts of America. I won't say it never happens, but
There are localized places where it happens, but it's
it's not as much as we maybe talk about. Okay.
yeah.
Just because we're not the favored part of culture anymore doesn't mean we're being persecuted. Anyway, but we can still talk about though, and kind of this experience of having a rougher go of things. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is because if we look at the motive, I think for most people, it's not that they hate Christians, it's not that they hate Christianity so much as they are trying to protect something that they do value. So in Pharaoh's case, he was trying to protect his power. In the case of, I think actually, probably in a lot of cases where we see the church or Christianity being disrespected or treated poorly in America today, it is because people are protecting essentially their sins or their freedom to sin or their like they. I think in most instances it comes down to we are saying something is wrong. People don't like being told they're wrong. So it's not that they hate Christianity; it's that they want to do what they can do. Like they want their freedom. But
They're trying to preserve the like constitutional rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that no longer looks like the Christian ethic.
yeah,
And that's what that's what we're running into in a lot of ways. And on some level, I think they're also trying to protect themselves from past abuses of the church, which
is fair-ish.
that's like 2% of it.
Yeah, you're well, and even you're painting with a broad brush.
Yeah.
Um,
I
so
That's what we always do.
fair enough. Yeah, you can't talk about specifics with any sort of usefulness. Um,
Yeah.
but what I want to point out is we have this worldly persecution, and how do the people of God respond? Well, they rely on God.
Mhm.
But like I said, this isn't Moses' mom being conniving and figuring out a way to save her son. And um and we'll get to this later. Like Moses isn't this isn't some grand scheme. He's pretty resistant of what he becomes uh a tool for
Mhm.
in God's plan. This is God at work to care for and rescue his people. And you get the famous quote uh, uttered creatively by Samuel L. Jackson in Pulp Fiction that God says, "I am something along the lines of I am vengeance, I will repay." And it's a really consistent theme through Scripture of when we are oppressed or whatever word you want to slot in there. It is not our job to take it upon ourselves to overthrow or to kind of take matters into our own hands. That onus is on God, who promises to take care of us, who promises to take care of the least of these, and we can
Mhm.
trust Him to do that.
Mhm.
Sometimes it just doesn't happen as quickly or in the shape that we might want it to, and that can be really hard when
Yeah.
you're dealing with a really crappy situation and you're praying to God, get me out of this. Get me out of this, whatever it is. And you wake up the next morning, you're still in that same place.
I
Um,
think I think one thing that's maybe helpful for us too in this, like if you're hearing what Josh is saying and you're thinking to yourself, so our response is to sit back and do nothing, that's also not quite right. Like,
Yeah.
look at the example of Moses's mother, because the strict instruction that Pharaoh gave the midwives that dealt with the Hebrew women was toss the babies in the river, right?
Not
Moses'
carefully
mom,
set them in a floating basket.
yeah, Moses' mom kind of does that,
And
but
send your daughter to watch to see where he ends up.
yeah, exactly. Like she takes care to provide for her son as much as is possible in hopes that there are opportunities for God to show his mercy to this child.
Yeah. So maybe, well, and even God acts through people. So maybe a way to look at it is we're not in the business of creating our own opportunities, but we are in the business of taking advantage of the opportunities God puts in front of us. Which,
Mhm.
I mean, to be fair, in America we have a lot of those opportunities, right? If you think that the government is, if you want to see the direction of government go a way that aligns more closely with your faith, you have the opportunity regularly to give input on who is in charge to whatever degree that can support our faith being a part of the government, right? We're not here to talk about that. We're definitely not here to talk about that. And when it's, when it's instances in culture, like we can take the opportunities we're given. Just sometimes it will mean sacrificing something on our own behalf. And something that comes to mind for me is, um, back when I was in high school, I applied for, I never ended up getting a job in high school, but I applied for a few. And for me, because I was looking for summer jobs, and we had church on Sunday morning, we had youth group on Sunday night, and we always had youth stuff on Wednesdays. So with every job application I put in, I said, cannot work Wednesdays, cannot work Sundays. Now, that probably hurt my chances of getting called in for an interview, right? And the similar, because once I was in college and I had part-time jobs, I made this statement: I do not work Sunday mornings. Um, and in some ways, that makes your life a little more difficult. It takes away some flexibility, but I had this opportunity to ask off on, or to say I don't work on certain days, and I took it. If you're in a role and you're like, I work on Sundays, you can say I don't work Sundays. You may have to stay later some other time. Like you may have to put up with something. You may have to suffer a little bit and make a sacrifice because you're not willing to work Sundays. But in a lot of cases, you have the opportunity to do that, um, which I think is a low. It's a non-threatening example. Like we have these freedoms in America, we can take advantage of, we can take opportunity of, uh, at very least to align our lives with the faith we profess.
Mhm.
There's just not always free.
Mhm. That's fair. So you shouldn't really call them freedoms.
I Well, freedom's not free, Ben. I read that on a t-shirt.
You should call them pay something for this dumb.
Why would I pay for a dumb? You can
That's
get
a good
dumb for
question.
free.
That's
Uh
yeah, we're so funny.
no.
Uh
If I edited these podcasts at all, I would probably cut that bit out. I don't.
uh
I
it's
don't
better
edit any of it.
it's better with it in there. Let's be honest with ourselves here.
I
So
guess.
in the midst of hardship or um, you know, even in persecution, um, we certainly have these responsibilities to remain faithful and to act in faith where and when we can. Um, how do you think that changes then when the thing causing the persecution goes from people to Satan?
Well, your opportunities disappear.
Yeah.
This is something this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's a tangent worth walking down a little bit. Um, I think people fall into two extremes when it comes to thinking about Satan. And if you're listening to this, maybe you fall into one of these extremes, in which case I'm gonna challenge you on it a little bit. So on one hand, there are people who completely disregard Satan. Either like there are people who would say, well, he's really a metaphor. Like the devil doesn't really exist. There is not this supremely powerful evil entity, not supremely powerful, penultimately powerful. Uh, that means second to the most powerful. Um, Little SAT word there for you. He's not out there seeking our downfall, or he doesn't really have any power to do anything. Biblically, I can say those things are incorrect. He has the power to do a whole lot. He's been given a long leash here on earth, and he is way more powerful than we could possibly imagine. On the other hand, in the other extreme, there are people who kind of attribute to him being God's equal, but on like kind of a yin and yang. Well, God is supremely powerful and he's good, and the devil is supremely powerful and he's evil. That is not the case. Satan's power doesn't hold a candle to God's, right? There is no competition, there is no contest here. But all this to say, when we're talking about, well, what if we're being spiritually persecuted by the devil and his kin? There is no opportunity you can take advantage of to do anything, because you can do nothing. You have no power. Right? Like it's like my son. My son is almost 4 months old. His hands are about yay big, and if we were to arm wrestle, he would not be able to do anything. He can't even sit up on his own yet, right? I am a weightlifter who is fairly good at what I do. There would be no contest. And frankly, that's kind of what we're dealing with. We can barely sit up on our own, and Satan benches 400 pounds. Like that's kind of just a window into the scope we're talking about. And that's underplaying it. So when we say, well, we got to take our opportunities, what opportunities do you, sir? Pray. Your opportunity is pray and let the Holy Spirit work in your life, and go to places the Holy Spirit promises to reside, right? Receive communion on a regular basis, be in church, be in the word, because that's where God has promised to be, and that is your only hope. If you feel spiritually persecuted, my brother or sister in Christ, pull out your Bible, because that is all you've got. That is your opportunity.
Confess the creed, pray the Lord's Prayer, call on the name of your Lord.
Yeah. Which back in the time where there were witches, they used to say like a witch, because a witch is in league with the devil, the witch can't say the Lord's Prayer. And I'm like, they did all these tests where like they drowned people or whatever else. It's like, couldn't they just say, can you say the Lord's Prayer? And if they could, well, I guess you're not a witch. Like what? That's always confused me. But I guess if you're really intent on burning someone at the stake, you're not really looking for something to let them off.
Get the bloodlust. It's really hard to think logically.
Yeah, fair enough.
This is also where
what do we do with witches? We burn them. What do we burn apart from witches? More witches.
Wood? In what way is the same as wood?
Water, very small rocks, lead. If you don't know this movie that I'm quoting here, again, educate yourself. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It is one of the greatest comedy movies I have ever seen. And if you tell me otherwise, I don't know that we can be friends anymore. They pretend they're riding horses through the whole movie by clapping coconuts together. And the main characters pretend that's not what's going on. They dismount their invisible horses on more than one occasion. What a great movie. We are so far from the point we started this podcast on.
So honestly, my head thought went to when you were talking about the ways that we push back on this kind of thing. My head went to, so you're telling me we shouldn't challenge the devil to a fiddling contest?
Not unless you can win. Ben is referencing a song that is the only country song on my favorites playlist called The Devil Went Down to Georgia. And the song is really about how there are so many faithful people in the state of Georgia that the devil had to go there personally to try and get one. And he couldn't do it. Because Georgia's the second best state in the union. Tied for second. I'll say tied for second. First is Tennessee.
Okay.
Then you look confused. First is Tennessee. Florida and Georgia are tied currently because Florida doesn't have an income tax and Georgia still does. I think they're working on getting rid of this. Again, you need to stop me from going on all these tangents. I'm obviously not focused enough to actually be recording a podcast right now. What is going on? I have hundreds of milligrams of caffeine in my system still from my morning workout. Like, I should be laser focused.
Maybe it's because you have hundreds of milligrams of caffeine.
No, it's fine.
Coursing through your veins.
It's probably fine.
That you can't focus.
It's probably fine.
Anyway, so I mean, I agree with you completely though. Like our response to persecution or oppression or hardship in the face of Satan or his forces is to lean into the things that our God has for us. Because
for anyone who is watching the video, you can now see my son's hand. Oh, this is just my son. You can see his hand. See, he's not winning an arm wrestle with anyone.
Yeah,
he's amazed that he's on a screen right now. He can't believe that.
What black magic is this? That my face.
Wait a second, that looks like me.
How does he have any concept of himself at this point?
Sometimes we'll put him in front of the mirror just to see what he does when he sees himself.
I tried that with our dog once.
He is not even 4 months old yet, so.
It took our dog a few months of doing that to stop barking at herself.
We have no mirrors low enough to the ground that Ghost can see himself in the mirror.
That might be intelligent.
It's not on purpose. It's just that's how our apartment is.
Fair.
But I think we've covered. I mean, the reality is, if demons and Satan are the ones who are coming after you, your only hope is God.
Yeah.
So meet him where he promises to be.
Yeah. And the last form of hardship that I wanted to bring up today, and this is another one that we, like I said, we kind of see in our story of just the circumstances that you're in. There will be times, there will be places where you're not being pressured by people, you're not being pressured by Satan or forces of evil. You're just being like put to the test by the circumstances you find yourself in the world. In scripture, that often happened through drought or famine. Though one very famous instance, there was a flood.
It's notable.
It is pretty notable. I think of in my own context here, circumstances surrounding like car accidents or power loss or like the heater goes out because a part in your appliance breaks. Like, these are not acts of Satan. These are just the thing wore thin, and now is the time that you get to suffer because of it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Speaking of suffering, Ezekiel. Um, well, where I want to kind of maybe insert some chaos, some additional chaos into this conversation that has obviously been very orderly and on focus so far, is if you look, Egypt, the Israelites are kind of stuck in Egypt, and a good Old Testament-y word for what they're doing is they are sojourning in Egypt. They are strangers in Egypt. This was prophesied to them. I think both Abraham and Jacob were warned by God or by a messenger from God. Your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. Like this, God is the one who sent the Israelites to Egypt. So when we say, well, call it the laws of the natural world, some of this I think you can say we live in a broken creation, and it's broken because of us, right? We're the ones who broke it. Thinking of your example of the part in the heater, right? Some of the entropy happens, right? But I don't think we should discount that through some of these things, it is God at work.
mm-hmm.
And we'll get this, we'll see this kind of as it comes out throughout Exodus, but God is very much behind the situation the Israelites are in. And part of it is because he is teaching them a lesson about who he is, about how much he cares for them, and about how far he's willing to go for them. Like in a little bit, we're going to talk about the plagues of Egypt. God's willing to go really far for his people. And in a lot of ways, well, and the New Testament does this intentionally. There are parallels drawn between the Exodus, which is the course focus of the book of Exodus is the Exodus.
Who would have thunk?
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
There are a lot of parallels between the Exodus and what Jesus accomplishes on the cross. Now, the Israelites were freed from literal slavery, and in Jesus we are freed still from literal slavery, but in a more abstract sense, slavery to sin. And there are a lot of these parallels, and part of the reason that the Israelites get stuck in this situation is because, and it's maybe it sounds tough, but God is making a point about who he is and what he's willing to do for his people. So sometimes we're going to face things in life and they're difficulties and they're hard and they're not fun to go through. But you have to think, well, maybe God put you there. And I can't tell you specifically why, right? If you're going through a tough situation, maybe God is trying to form you. Maybe God is putting you in a specific place at a specific time to accomplish something. And you're putting up with everything else because he sent you to do something, and then he'll move you along. Or maybe he's putting you through a bad time so that later you can commiserate with someone else who's gone through a bad time, and you can be a support and a beacon for them that ultimately brings them into contact with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Right? I can't tell it, even if you give me a specific situation, I can't tell you why. But I can tell you that there are definitely some instances where call it persecution, call it oppression, call it suffering. It's fair to say that it's God's fault, and that's not God being bad. That's not God somehow being sinful. That is just we are hard-headed, and sometimes we need aggressive lessons for God to get his point across.
Yep. I mean, think about it like, I'm sure you don't have Zeke on a leash, but you could probably think about the dog this way. Every once in a while, our dog will note something in the road and she'll want to chase. She'll want to investigate. And if there's a truck going by, that's not the time to investigate. And you need to use something forceful to keep her alive. Um, you mentioned a story not too long ago about a bird that Ghost unfortunately
Yeah,
encountered.
the leash didn't. I didn't act quickly enough. That bird died.
Um, yeah, but like you run into circumstances where you need forceful like correction of your actions. And we're talking about the creator of the universe here. So like what better way for him to guide, correct, and train us than with the creation, the thing that he is ultimately Lord and Master over all of. Um, so yeah, there are always going to be times and situations and things where God is working to prepare us or correct us. And there are also just times where we are facing the general repercussions of our sin. And again, what are we called to do in the midst of that kind of hardship, but lean into God further?
Yeah, and this is a place where this is one of the many places where Christian community is so important
Mhm.
because they can speak into those situations in your life and they can say, "Hey, I know this sucks right now, but I can see God working through this." Or they can help you, they can help remind you, "Hey, we need to draw closer to God when we face stuff like this." Um, they can point out maybe it is because you're a bonehead and they can say this is on you, and that they do that in a loving, but like having those outside voices in your life can be one of the ways that the Holy Spirit helps your perception and reception of the different things, that the different sufferings that are going on in your life, which is a crazy part of our broken nature, that when we're going through hard times, we have a tendency to draw into ourselves and to isolate ourselves, even when that is the time where we most need others.
Yeah, because the part that we've kind of danced around in this whole episode and haven't really addressed directly, but like even when we draw into ourselves, no matter what the hardship is, God is there with us in that hardship. And sometimes we're just too daft to open our own eyes and recognize it. So when we have that community around us, when we have, brothers and sisters in Christ, or um, people who have kind of mentored or parented us in the faith, there to just kind of open our eyes and help us recognize the way that God is continuing to work in our lives, it helps us to better see those things. We're not all going to have the same kind of obvious, like you look back and you see exactly how God was planning things out that Moses had, where he got shoved into a basket, put in a river, and happened to float by the grace of God alone to Pharaoh's daughter. Like that is a clear showing of God with him in that moment. We may not have quite that clear a set of circumstances, but we can have confidence that our God is with us in these kinds of hardship or oppression. And sometimes you just need to find someone that's not you, maybe somebody that's got some wisdom beyond your years that can show you where it's at.
Yeah. I think we're ready for takeaways. Am I reading the virtual room correctly?
I think you are, yeah.
Um, and if it's okay, I can kick us off.
Go for it.
The takeaway being that suffering or oppression or persecution can come from a variety of different places, but the response to all of them is the same. Look for where God is working and draw closer to that.
Mhm.
as much as you are able and however you are able.
Mhm. And even when he feels distant, this is my takeaway here. Even when he feels distant, recognize that he is still there, and you don't have to go about that process of drawing closer to him alone. Like, find the people in your life, friends, mentors, confessors, whatever the case may be, who can show you where he is working in your life. Just as he was with Moses, just as he was with the people of Israel throughout that time of oppression in Egypt. He is working there for you. And I was trying to think of a clever way to segue this into subscribing to our podcast on whatever platform you use. But I guess if you subscribe to the or to the podcast,
You
we're
can
never
increase
that
your
far away.
suffering.
Well, you could increase your suffering, or you could just never be that far away from us, your favorite Man Buns and Jesus titled podcast.
And
Yeah.
also, like, share. We would love to see this podcast grow. But neither of us are really into self-promotion. I'm pretty sure I'm fair in saying we're like, that's antithetical to how we go about what we do.
Yeah.
But we're okay
I'm
with you
terrible at
promoting us
taking
if you can share these especially I think this one can be a good one to share, especially with people you know who are going through tough times. And we hope that kind of a hopeful attitude is what came out of this podcast. And if you received this from a friend and you listened through it, and you're going through a tough time, and that's why this ended up in front of you, we're praying for you. Even if we don't know who you are, we're praying for you, and we hope that God's work is made apparent to you even in the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
On a much lighter note, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and also we sell ridiculous merchandise. I'm probably not going to make that other shirt I mentioned earlier in the episode, but we do have.
You didn't actually mention that in the episode, I don't think.
Oh, I didn't.
No, I don't know.
No, I'm pretty sure that was. You know what? Someone comment if the platform you listen on supports such things. Comment and let me know if you have any idea what I'm talking about. But we do have a shirt that has silhouettes of our faces on it, and on the back it says something to the effect of, "I like this podcast so much, I put the host's faces on my shirt." And you can buy it. It's a really nice shirt. It's like the nicest T-shirt I could find for them to print it on. Just go to edgewaterlutheran.org/gear, and you can get yourself a Man Buns and Jesus shirt. We are starting season 5. We have a bunch of we'll be walking through the book of Exodus. We have a bunch of topics and hosts or guests lined up. But if you have a specific topic you'd like us to cover, especially if you want us to pay close attention to something in Exodus, by all means, let us know. If you would like to come on and talk about some part of Exodus, or you have someone in mind that you think would be good, again, by all means, let us know. And if you have our personal contact, email, phone, whatever, you can use that. If not, if you kind of just stumbled across this podcast and you don't know us personally, cool. Hi. We have a Facebook page, Man Buns and Jesus, that you can reach out to. We check it from time to time, and we'll get your communication that way. So with all of those shameless plugs out of the way, go to church on Sunday. We'll see you there, and go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.